Rich son abandons his mother in a nursing home, learns a painful lesson on Mother's Day. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and happy Mother's Day. The morning sunlight streamed through the penthouse windows, casting a golden glow over the pristine marble floors. Ethan Reynolds sat at his sleek, glass dining table, sipping an espresso while scrolling through emails on his phone. His schedule was packed: meetings, client calls, dinner with investors, but there was one appointment he dreaded most. "Sir, your car is ready," his driver Mark informed him. Ethan sighed. "Let's get this over with." The drive to Willow Haven Senior Care was smooth, the roads eerily quiet for a Saturday. He barely noticed the city's rhythm. His mind was elsewhere. His mother, Margaret Reynolds, had lived with him for 2 years after his father passed. At first, he thought it would be a temporary arrangement, but time stretched, and Margaret became an inconvenience in his structured life. Her forgetfulness, her late-night ramblings about the past, her slow, fragile steps, it was too much. He had a company to run, an image to maintain. As they pulled up to the nursing home, Ethan stepped out and adjusted his tailored suit. He wanted this to be quick. Inside, the smell of disinfectant mixed with the faint scent of lavender air freshener. The walls were adorned with pastel paintings, an attempt to make the place feel warm. To Ethan, it felt clinical, detached. Margaret sat in a cushioned chair near the window, a small suitcase at her feet. She looked up at him, her gentle eyes filled with a quiet sadness. "You came," she said softly. "Of course, Mom," Ethan replied, forcing a smile. A nurse approached, paperwork in hand. "Mr. Reynolds, if you could just sign here, we'll take great care of her." Margaret placed her hand over Ethan's. "You're sure this is best?" Ethan hesitated. Something in her voice made his stomach twist. But then he reminded himself of his long hours, his need for peace. "Yes, Mom. It's for the best." She nodded slowly, her fingers trembling as she reached for her suitcase. Ethan gave her a stiff hug. "I'll visit," he promised. Margaret smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I know you're busy." As Ethan walked out, the automatic doors slid shut behind him with a quiet hiss. He didn't look back. That night, as he dined in a high-end restaurant, laughing with colleagues, an unsettling feeling lingered in the back of his mind, one he couldn't quite shake. The first few weeks after Margaret moved into Willow Haven were quiet. Too quiet. Ethan barely noticed at first. His life was too busy, his calendar filled with back-to-back meetings, corporate events, and business trips. Whenever a twinge of guilt crept in, he pushed it aside. His mother was being taken care of. She was in a good facility. That was enough, wasn't it? At first, he had promised to visit often, but one weekend turned into 2, then 3. Soon, an entire month had passed without him setting foot in the nursing home. His mother never called, perhaps out of pride, or maybe because she knew he wouldn't pick up. The only time he heard about her was through the automated emails from Willow Haven, updating him on her general well-being. Then came the first phone call. Ethan was in his office, reviewing quarterly reports when his assistant Jenna knocked softly. "There's a call for you, sir, from Willow Haven." He frowned. "Did they say why?" "No, just that it's important." Ethan sighed, putting his pen down. "Put them through." A soft but firm voice came on the line. "Mr. Reynolds? This is Nurse Carol from Willow Haven. I'm calling about your mother." A flicker of concern ran through him. "Is she okay?" "She's fine, physically, but we've noticed she's been isolating herself. She doesn't join the group activities and she spends most of her time sitting by the window. She doesn't talk much, except to ask if you visited." Ethan rubbed his temple. "Look, I've been busy. I run a company. I can't just drop everything." "I understand," Carol said, her tone professional yet tinged with something close to disappointment. "But a visit from you would mean a lot to her." "I'll try," he muttered, though he had no intention of making promises he couldn't keep. That night he lay awake in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling. Margaret had always been there for him through every scraped knee, every school play, every heartbreak. She had worked 2 jobs to put him through college after his father passed, never once complaining. And now she was alone in a place full of strangers, waiting for a visit that might never come. Weeks turned into months. Every now and then, Ethan would glance at the calendar and think about visiting, but something always came up. Business trips, networking events, deals to close. He told himself she was fine, that the staff at Willow Haven were trained professionals, until Mother's Day arrived. That morning, as Ethan scrolled through his phone, he was bombarded with social media posts, friends posting pictures with their mothers, heartfelt tributes, brunch celebrations. Then came an email from Willow Haven. Subject, Your mother would love a visit today. Dear Mr. Reynolds, today is Mother's Day, and many of our residents are spending time with their families. Your mother, Margaret Reynolds, has not had any visitors for several months. A visit would mean the world to her. Ethan stared at the screen, guilt clawing at his chest. He had plans, an exclusive yacht party with potential investors, but as he set his phone down, something gnawed at him. Then Jenna walked in. "Happy Mother's Day, sir," she said cheerfully. "Doing anything special for Mrs. Reynolds?" Ethan forced a smile. "Actually, I think I will." For the first time in 6 months, he made his way to Willow Haven. When he arrived, the lobby was lively. Families filled the common areas, children hugged their elderly parents, laughter and chatter filled the space. But as he walked past the rooms, his stomach twisted. Margaret sat alone by the window, staring outside. Her hair had thinned, her frame was smaller than he remembered. She held a card in her frail hands, turning it over slowly. Ethan hesitated before stepping inside. "Mom?" Margaret turned, her cloudy blue eyes widening in surprise. Then she smiled, weak but genuine. "Ethan, you came." Guilt hit him like a freight train. I should have come sooner," he admitted, pulling up a chair. She shook her head. "I knew you were busy." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. He glanced at the card in her hands. "What's that?" Margaret handed it to him. It was a generic Mother's Day card from the nursing home staff. "They give them to everyone," she said quietly. In case someone doesn't get one." Ethan's chest tightened. His mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, had spent Mother's Day alone, receiving a card out of pity. His jaw clenched. "I'm taking you out today, Mom. Anywhere you want to go." She blinked, surprised. "Really? Really?" A flicker of warmth returned to her face. Then, "Can we go to the park? The one where we used to go when you were little?" Ethan nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, Mom, of course." As he helped her into the car, a strange, unfamiliar ache settled in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he wondered, had he made a mistake? The car ride to Maplewood Park was quiet. Margaret sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, staring out the window as the city passed by. Ethan stole a few glances at her. She looked smaller, more fragile than he remembered. The vibrancy she once had, the warmth that made her seem invincible in his childhood, had dimmed. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Had he done this to her? At the park, Ethan found a bench beneath a sprawling oak tree, the same spot where she used to bring him when he was little. Margaret settled onto the bench with a slow, careful movement, sighing contentedly as she gazed at the small lake ahead. "I used to sit right here while you played," she murmured, a wistful smile on her lips. "You loved the ducks. You'd chase them until you fell into the grass, giggling." Ethan chuckled, though the memory felt distant, like a life that belonged to someone else. "I was a handful." She nodded. "But you were my handful." Silence stretched between them. Ethan shifted, glancing at his watch. He wasn't used to sitting still. His life was fast, always moving, always looking ahead. But right now, sitting here with his mother, he felt something strange. Stillness. Margaret turned to him. "Tell me about work. You're doing well?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, the company's growing fast. We closed a huge deal last month. Investors are happy." "That's good," she said softly. "And your personal life? Are you happy?" Ethan hesitated. "I guess." Margaret studied him for a moment, then looked back at the lake. "I worry about you, Ethan." His jaw tightened. "Mom, I'm fine." She sighed. "You've always been so driven. Even as a boy, you never wanted help with anything. So independent. I admired that, but..." Her voice trailed off. "But what?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes independence can turn into loneliness." Ethan scoffed lightly. "I'm not lonely, Mom. I have everything I need." Margaret didn't argue. Instead, she reached for his hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "I just hope you don't realize too late that the things you chase aren't the things that matter." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He glanced around the park, watching families laughing together, children running, couples strolling hand in hand. He had everything: a luxury penthouse, a multi-million-dollar business, respect, power. But when was the last time he sat like this? When was the last time he shared a moment that wasn't tied to an agenda, a transaction? Before he could respond, Margaret exhaled, a small shiver running through her. "You okay?" he asked, concerned. She waved a hand dismissively. Just a little tired. We should head back, he said, helping her up. As he guided her to the car, she squeezed his hand. Thank you for today, Ethan. It meant more than you know. He forced a smile, but the unease in his chest deepened. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying Margaret's words in his mind. Was she right? Had he spent his whole life chasing success at the cost of everything else? His phone buzzed on the nightstand. He groaned, reaching for it. Unknown number. Frowning, he answered. Hello? Mr. Reynolds? It was a familiar voice. Nurse Carol, from Willow Haven. Ethan sat up. Yes? I'm calling about your mother. There was an incident. His heart stopped. What happened? She collapsed in her room earlier this evening. The paramedics took her to St. Vincent's Hospital. Ethan was already throwing on his jacket. Is she okay? She's stable for now. But the doctor wants to speak with you. Ethan didn't even respond. He was out the door in seconds. When he arrived at the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic filled his lungs. He found Margaret in a small, dimly lit room, looking frail against the stark white sheets. Machines beeped softly, monitoring her vitals. His stomach twisted at the sight of her. A doctor entered, a clipboard in hand. Mr. Reynolds? Ethan stood. How is she? She's stable, but her body is weak. She's been malnourished, and the stress hasn't helped. Her heart is under strain. Ethan frowned. Malnourished? But she's in a nursing home. The doctor sighed. Physically, she was eating, but emotionally, she was starving. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Your mother has been lonely, Mr. Reynolds, the doctor continued. Isolation, especially for the elderly, can take a significant toll. She needed more than just medical care. She needed companionship. Guilt surged through Ethan like a tidal wave. She's awake, the doctor said gently. You can go in. Ethan stepped inside, his mother's eyes fluttering open at the sound of his footsteps. Ethan, she whispered weakly. He swallowed past the lump in his throat. Mom, I'm here. She smiled faintly. You always were. Just a little late. His chest ached. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I should have been there. I should have come sooner. Margaret's frail hand reached for his. You're here now. Tears burned the back of his eyes. For the first time in his life, success didn't matter. His company didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the woman lying in this hospital bed, the woman who had loved him unconditionally, even when he had abandoned her. He squeezed her hand, and he vowed that he would never leave her alone again. Ethan sat by his mother's bedside, her frail hand resting in his. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filled the room, a stark reminder of how fragile life truly was. Margaret gave him a tired smile. You look worried, she murmured. I am, Ethan admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Mom, he paused, his throat tightening. I should have been here. I should have visited more. I don't know why I let so much time pass. Margaret squeezed his hand weakly. I know why, sweetheart. Ethan frowned. Why? She sighed, looking out the window. Because you were chasing something you thought mattered more, and I didn't want to be the one to hold you back. His chest ached. You were never holding me back, Mom. I was just too blind to see what was really important. Silence settled between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. I didn't realize how lonely you were, Ethan whispered. Margaret smiled softly. I had the memories to keep me company. The nights I spent rocking you to sleep, the mornings we made pancakes together, the times I sat in the audience at your school plays watching you shine. Those moments carried me through. She paused, her eyes growing distant. But I would have liked a few new ones. The weight of her words crushed him. He had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, believing that wealth and success were what defined a good life. But what was all of it worth if, in the end, he had no one to share it with? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. A nurse stepped in with a gentle smile. Mr. Reynolds, the doctor wants to go over some things with you. Ethan nodded, reluctant to leave his mother's side. I'll be back, he promised. Margaret squeezed his hand. I know. Outside, the doctor's expression was neutral but serious. Your mother's condition is stable for now, but her body is weak. She needs proper care, emotional support, and less stress. He hesitated before continuing. Mr. Reynolds, I have to be honest. If she goes back to the nursing home and continues living in isolation, her health will decline. Ethan's stomach twisted. So what are you saying? I'm saying she needs to be somewhere she feels loved, somewhere she isn't just another patient on a chart. Ethan's mind raced. He had a busy life, a demanding career. How could he possibly take care of her? But then he thought about the empty penthouse he returned to every night. The cold, lifeless walls, the silence. His mother had always been there for him. Why hadn't he been there for her? The answer was clear. The following week, Ethan stood outside Willow Haven, watching as the staff helped Margaret into his car. She looked surprised, confused even. "I don't understand," she said as Ethan buckled her seatbelt. "You're coming home with me," he said simply. Margaret blinked. "Ethan, you don't have to do this." "I know," he said, "but I want to." The drive home felt different. He wasn't just taking her somewhere out of obligation. He was bringing her back where she belonged. As they stepped into his penthouse, Margaret looked around, her eyes filled with wonder. "I forgot how beautiful this place is." Ethan smiled. "It always felt a little empty without you." She chuckled softly. "I doubt that. You've built quite a life for yourself, a life that didn't have you in it," he admitted. "And that was my biggest mistake." Margaret reached out, cupping his face with her frail hand. "You were never a bad son, Ethan, just a lost one." His throat tightened. Not anymore. A year later, Mother's Day arrived again, but this time it was different. Ethan stood in the kitchen, flipping pancakes, the scent of butter and maple syrup filling the air. Margaret sat at the dining table, watching with amusement. "You've come a long way from the kid who used to burn toast," she teased. Ethan laughed. "I learned from the best." He placed a plate in front of her, along with a small, neatly wrapped box. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" "Just open it," Ethan said, smiling. She carefully unwrapped the gift, revealing a photo frame. Inside was a picture of the two of them, taken at the park on the day he had finally come back for her. Below it, a handwritten note. "Every moment with you is a gift. Thank you for never giving up on me. I love you, Mom." Margaret's eyes welled with tears as she clutched the frame to her chest. "Oh, Ethan." He reached across the table, holding her hand. "I wasted too much time, Mom. I'm not wasting any more." For the first time in a long time, Margaret looked truly happy. And for the first time in his life, Ethan knew what real success felt like. It wasn't money. It wasn't power. It was this, being here, being present, and knowing he had finally made the right choice. In the end, success isn't measured by wealth or status, but by the love we share with those who matter most. Ethan learned this lesson the hard way. Don't let it take a lifetime to realize what truly matters. If this story touched you, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more powerful stories like this one.